We're here for the proposed Crown Lands legislation inquiry, and I'll ask, with our second respondent, we'll ask your name and eventual title.
Kevin Armstrong, and I've been a resident of the Central Coast for some 44 years.
Kevin, I know that you have followed the administration and use of Crown Lands in our local area for many years. Have you got a broad comment about the proposed legislation in front of the New South Wales Government at the moment?
Look, I think there's three major things that happened in the last couple of months. The New South Wales Auditor General released a fairly scathing report about the management of Crown Land, and in fact a lot of maladministration within the department, including that where Crown Land is being sold or long-term leased, most of those negotiations have gone on one-on-one rather than being advertised and open and transparent. So there was a fairly damning audit report. The second major thing that's happened has been an upper house inquiry into Crown Land, and I think that's been, from most perspectives, fairly disappointing in the conclusions, given the evidence that was placed before that inquiry. The third thing that's happened is that legislation has appeared in Parliament, seemingly without really responding to the first two things that have happened. So it would appear to a layperson that the legislation was drafted and that the inquiry may have happened to make it look as though that was being supported, where in fact the legislation was going to happen. It seems to me as a layperson that the government is simply brushing the problem away rather than deal with mismanagement as defined by the Auditor General of New South Wales. It seems to me the government is simply trying to brush the problem away. If the Act's the problem, let's get rid of the Act, let's devolve ownership to local councils, and the problem's solved.
Kevin, I know that you followed our local council, previously called Gosford Council, where this studio is located. The mismanagement of Crown Lands, I've heard much talk about that. In what shape and form does that happen?
Well, as one example locally, we have what's called a pop-up pie shop down near the boat ramp in the middle of the waterfront area. Lease clearly conducted with one party. The lease seems to have expanded from what was permissible as a refreshment room under the Crown Lands Act. The current occupancy of that pie shop is about 3 times what it would be, what would be allowed under the Crown Lands Act. Instead of being a removable building, there's now concrete foundations around. There's been an area constructed at the rear of that building for servicing of the facility, and now there's pop-up umbrellas in the parkland further out on the side. So as a piece of transparent negotiation, it would score -4 on a scale of 10.
Those lands in this area and others that, as I understand it, were meant to be administered or at least overviewed by trusts for various parcels of land. Is there a problem in those in that administration as far as you're concerned?
As I understand it, Gosford Council has always treated its trust responsibilities as though it's just normal council. Council has not held, as far as I can ascertain, separate trust meetings, which it's required to do. And certainly if you look at Council's annual report, the revenue that comes from the lease of those Crown Lands has not been applied, hasn't been reported the way it should have been, nor has it been applied to the maintenance of those facilities that have been leased.
So there's certainly an issue with the administration of trusts under the existing legislation. How do you think, for example, will this proposed legislation, how could it play out as far as the Central Coast or / Gosford area is concerned?
Well, what we're seeing is that the state proposes to keep what I understand to be relatively limited land as state land, but virtually the majority of Crown Land, as we now know it, will be devolved to local councils to administer. It's going over as community land, and supposedly that provides protection under the Local Government Act. But we've recently seen here a proposal from Gosford City Council to sell off 25 reserves Some of it may have been Crown land, no one really quite knows, but Council couldn't even follow the procedures that it was required to do to sell off that land. So devolving responsibility for additional Crown land to an organisation that's demonstrated to be incompetent to manage the process under the Local Government Act seems to me to be simply folly.
There's a theme in this as far as the expectations of council to have the necessary skills to manage public or state, as it were, state land in its own rights. The new legislation, as far as you can see, seems to ignore that lack of competence in many councils. How do you think, to go back to, how do you think that would play out over the longer period of time if such legislation was to come into force?
Look, it's very hard to say because the management of council/Crown land at the moment is a very mixed bag. Councils under the Local Government Act, for example, are required to have plans of management. Now, I accept there's active land, active recreation land, there's passive recreation land. Generic plans of management are fine. But to use Gosford as an example, plans of management simply don't exist for a lot of the land the council has. Council's land register doesn't even adequately identify what council owns as council-owned land and what Crown land it is currently trustee for. If you go to the Department of Lands to get information, you've either got to pay an exorbitant fee or they're simply unable to provide you with information as to who owns what land. And that's been evident recently in the public school site with a supposed paper road across the back of that through what is currently reserved and has been reserved for at least 40 years that I'm aware of. That's currently having sewer pipes put through it and will become a public road. As we understand it, that as reclaimed land is in fact Crown land. So it's very difficult to understand how council can move machinery onto that, simply dig big holes, construct through a road through, put pipes through what is currently Crown land. It's very difficult to understand how that's responsible.
There's certainly no one would argue with the fact that there's problems with the administration of Crown land as it stands. To go back to the inquiry that was held, I understand the Upper House inquiry did stop here, not far from here in Gosford. And though it does, as you said, does not seem to address some of the issues that were picked up in that particular inquiry, what sort of improvements would you have expected in the draft legislation before the House at the moment?
Look, I would have expected that inquiry addressed some of the issues that were raised about the inappropriate use of reserves. It's quite obvious here locally that many parcels of Crown land have been leased long-term to private organisations. The rental from those is not being applied to the maintenance of those Crown lands as is required by law. And it seems to me that rather than face the litany of maladministration in the past, the government is simply proposing to get rid of the Crown Lands Act. They're going way back to when the colony was first formed. The folks in England, and I can't recall the gentleman's name, gave instructions to the governor to set aside public land, to set aside what then became Crown land. And that's been enshrined in legislation since the early colony. A very famous High Court case, Rutledge and Randwick Council, back in, I think, 1959, reinforced the sanctity of Crown land. And that was again reinforced only recently in the case of King Edward Park, where developers wanted to put a function facility and a restaurant on Crown land in Newcastle. That went to the Land and Environment Court, and the sanctity of Crown land, the fact that people should be able to access Crown land as a right without paying a fee was reinforced very strongly in that case. That was brought to the Land and Environment Court by a community group.
Well, that's some very interesting and relevant points. I hope that they assist the legislators make up their mind. just finally, on the rush nature of this and really this hastened digital democracy attempt that we have here in the studio, have you anything to say about the timing in this regard?
Look, the timing is unfortunate. Legislation should not be rushed through Parliament. It's very clear to me that this legislation is being rushed. It was put into the upper house only a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks laying rest, and then it will be brought to the lower house. It's very clearly an attempt to rush through legislation, not allow adequate community comment, not allow people to have a say in what happens to something like 44% of the land in New South Wales is Crown land. I believe that the size of the land and the potential value of that land demands that there be proper consideration over a period of at least 6 months, in my view.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you for your submission.